1.
Welcome to 1,001 Ways to Cope with Stress. I am Professor Kinshasa Shabaka, and we continue with our 6-part series. We have as our guest the noted Dr. Fred Manderson, historian, Egyptologist, and a prolific writer. This session is part 5, and we are talking about the wall. Thank you, Dr. Manderson, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
There are a number of things I'd like to get started with today. I would like to first of all point out that this notion or the concept of the wall is multifaceted. We know that there were fortress walls, and armies on the move created siege walls. There were even canals had walls, pools had walls. The sacred lake at Karnak Temple was repaired by Thutmose III, and he created a wall around the edges to so that everything would be symmetrical. We know that the principal issue about the wall as it relates to the temple per se is that the wall was both a protective device as well as a canvas upon which art depicting whether it's the exploits of the king in his praise of the gods or the actual ritual of the temple. However, to hark back to our first session, which dealt with the cosmological, the spiritual, and esoteric dynamics, I like to just reflect back upon it and put a couple of things in perspective. First and foremost, the ancient Egyptians were these black Africans who inhabited the Nile. They were called Egyptians by the Greeks. They came up with some of the most far-reaching cosmological concepts that has been up to today not been fully and truly evaluated. You see, we know that the god emerged from a watery abyss, sat on his sacred mound, and began creating living things and the world as we know it. Then he chose his adherents, who became priests, and instructed them on the type of structure to create to protect him. And hence, we have the first wall as a protective device. The Egyptians believe that, however, that there was a universe that preceded the universe that we know. And this universe was comprised of matter that was made of water. The best source for this is Theophile Obenga. He has written this book called African Philosophy in the Era of the Pharaohs. Dr. Obenga was the research associate of Dr. Chikanta Diop. It's interesting how they met, because he actually ran after him in Paris and found him in the bathroom taking care of business, and he said to him, I wanted to be one of your associate, and they worked together, and they're this duo, Egyptological duo, black men of tremendous intellectual potential. They represented the black world at the Cairo conference in 1974, and they were featured in the final report by UNESCO stating that, 1, they were the best prepared of all the participants, and 2, they affirmed, based on these people's research, that Egypt was essentially and fundamentally a black civilization. Okay. So what he did was he indicated that, and let me give you a couple of quotes here. He says that there was a universe prior to this universe that we know of. the Egyptians posited matter at the very origin of the universe, a primordial matter very different from what was later to emerge out of it. That is to say, even though the God emerged, he emerged from somewhere, because as you know, nothing comes out of nothing. They posited matter prior to all else, before the demiurge and the other divinities issuing therefrom, thereafter, before heaven and earth, before living creatures, and their evolving life before the entire universe, before the cosmos as a whole. There was a pre-existent form before the existent came into existence to exist. Okay? So we need to understand that the mind of the African was evolving for hundreds of thousands of years. And the argument that the Egyptians were Caucasians from Southwest Asia is a fallacious argument. I was reading Dr. Asa Hillard, his book Sabak, and he prepared a bibliography for serious students. And what he is saying in essence is that our young people, first of all, have to trust our researchers who are out there in the field, but they must commit themselves to do serious work. They must create a wall of truth, include omissions and distortion and correct distortion, so that 100 years from today, there will be evidence of Africans in Egypt, as opposed to relying on the European scholarship. That is not to say that we're not to read the European writings, but we must critically analyze what they say, because for the fact of the matter is that they did the research to reclaim Egypt from the bowels of the earth. But we must read them critically before we accept any posited ideas. Okay? So, as I said, that there was this pre-existent reality that existed before the existent came into existence.
Sounds a little circular, but I agree.
Not really. But if you look at it, there was something before what came to exist, then that today exists. Okay? The name given to the primal matter, absolute mass of water. Water is the source of all life, and this is where the God was born out of water. Egypt is a desert country. It has one source, the Nile, but psychologically, and they have created concepts of water that boggles imagination. Pools in heaven that are designed so that when you get there, you don't really exist in a desert environment. That's one of the differences between living in this world and the next. So this was a sort of all-encompassing ocean existing before any form of life known to us. It predated all motion, and as we understand it, it was reality before the universe we know, already pregnant with the raw material of creation in a latent form. Here was the chaotic medium of incipient forms, the unheard of pre-temporal manifestation of the Creator God. In the cosmogony of the Book of the Dead, Genesis was the constitution of the cosmos in its present form. The process began with the primal waters, a reality older than the Creator God, who emerged from this very primal abyss of water. Indeed, it was within this primal chaos that the demiurge or God force achieved consciousness of self. Only after self-consciousness did the demiurge come into real existence on its own and by itself. Then it's set to work. So by setting to work, it then began to create life as we know it, plants, animals, humans, and then it chose humans as to be its servants and instructed them on how to worship, how to ritualize, how to create structures, and so forth. Thus, from the perspective of ancient Egyptian pharaonic philosophy, then, all components of the world as it is now, goddesses, gods, and stars, sky and earth, the world of the living and the abode of the dead, in short, every dimension of the existence had a starting point, a genesis. The one exception was Noon, the absolute reality of the primal waters. The existence of Noon was posited as such in its sheer absolute quality. Noon was the uncreated reality of moist water depths, the fecundating and creating principle. So this here is an addenda to the poem which sought to place Amun within the philosophical construct as the Egyptian mind created and experienced him to be. We have to be use two tools of analysis. One is continuity, recognize continuity, and the second is analogy. Because when we come to understand Karnak Temple, there is very little data that precedes the Middle Kingdom. So for the earlier period, we have to use another instance to conceptualize how Karnak came into being. Two examples can suffice. One is the temple of Queen Hatshepsut, who ruled at Karnak, who built a mortuary temple, the Deir el-Bahari, across the river, and Amenhotep III, who built Luxor Temple. Okay, the point is that at the construction of a temple, first of all, the site has to be chosen and sacralized, made holy. And very few instances, as we know it, did the Egyptians create a new temple from what is called a tabula rasa. The
Blank.
yes, the thank you. The religious revolutionary Amenhotep IV, he had built a temple when it came his time to rule. He had built a temple at Karnak beyond the Eastern Gate, but he had problems with what he saw. So he removed himself to a place called Amarna and built a new city and erected a new temple. It's one of the few instances where we know that a new temple was actually constructed. That's not to say there weren't others. The 19th dynasty, Seti built his temple at Karnak, he built his temple at Abydos, Ramses II built the Abu Simbel temple, and so forth. But at the foundation of a temple, a ceremony is performed wherein the god Thoth and his wife Sishat in the mythology are the creators of divine structures for worship, the house of the god. So what we have is that the king would represent Thoth and his wife would represent Sishat, which was the goddess of these two earlier divinities. They would stretch the cord, that is to say, mark out the dimensions of the temple, and then begin the ceremony of the foundation. That is to say, you've marked out the dimension, you would create the surface in a level format. It would be covered with white sand. An animal would be killed and its blood allowed to flow to fecundate the holiness of the site. Tools that were being used to construct the temple, miniature examples of those would be deposited in a particular site, in the structure, in the area, and then the cartouche or the name of the builder, the king or queen who commissioned the temple, would be included, and then this would be covered up, and there would be a ceremony of ritual and what have you. Now, there is evidence of that at Deir el-Bahari, and there is evidence of it at Luxor Temple. it is so important because there was a 19th dynasty temple beside the Ramuseum that was completely raised. There was nothing above ground. But they were able to trace this temple's outlines based on the same dynamics I just mentioned. They even found miniature examples of the tools, the name of the queen who commissioned the temple, and so forth. Okay, so that sort of gives us, that's why I say we need analogy to understand how Karnak came into being. We're in the next section, I'm going to try to sketch some aspects of the history of Karnak, but we need to understand that this process I just explained to you had to have begun so that Karnak could move forward as a holy site. The Egyptians never really tore down in Oxford University. They build on top of existing structure. And the same thing we have in Egypt, because once a site has been sacralized, it's holy. So even subsequent kings who come there would build on that same site. It's interesting because Louis Leakey's wife, Mary, she chronicled many prehistoric sites that early man inhabited, and it was found that they used the walls of the sites, the caves, or wherever they lived, and they painted over each surface. They never rubbed anything out, and you will find that there were sometimes 10, 12 different layers of art on that temple, on that site that these people inhabited. So it's the same thing we see there. Now, Karnak, as I said, today I want to really begin to deal with the wall. But first of all, I want to give you an idea of where some of my consciousness comes from as a Pan-Africanist. First and foremost, I like to show you these two photographs. This one here, which is of my grandmother, her name is Cherise Prevail. She was the family's first Pan-African internationalist. She was born in the 19th century, and she taught us the way that African people, irrespective of where they are from, are one people. And we must recognize that.
See that? Hold that up.
And second...
Did you get that? Okay.
Second, my mom's.
Oh my,
Mita Monderson. My grandmother, Cherise Prevail, and my mom's, Mita Monderson.
I love it.
She is dressed in the flag of Ghana. On March 6, 1957, my mother was out there fighting for the independence of Ghana. 60 years ago, on March 6 of 2017, it would have been 60 years where we as Pan-Africanists were fighting for the independence of African people. So I wanted to get that in so that you'll be aware of something about my background.
What gets you to where, yes, indeed. Your fervor. That's wonderful.
So I talked about the foundation ceremony, and that the fact that God set about working in terms of creating the parameters of the temple, and of course the wall, as I said, was a protective device, so that for two things really. One, what happened in the temple stayed in the temple. It's not like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happened in the temple stayed in the temple, and the ceremonies and the sounds could not be observed because we are talking about a big structure, 40 feet high, and encompassing something like maybe 20 feet wide and what have you, okay? So the wall, the first wall we know of was the white wall that was built by Narmer. Narmer was a Theban who unified Egypt at the beginning of dynastic rule. He diverted the river Nile and created a city called Memphis. And he built a wall around Memphis and painted it white, and it was called the White Wall. Okay, but Karnak Temple per se, Karnak Temple was enclosed by an enclosure wall. Karnak Temple, which is the home of the Theban triad, the god, his wife, and his son, was divided up into three sections. You had the northern section where the war god Montu was the preeminent deity. Karnak, where Amun dwelt, was the central location, and the southern location was where Mut, the god's wife, resided. So there was a binding wall that enclosed all three of these sections of this Theban location of where the gods resided. Karnak per se had its own, so we have a binding wall, we have an enclosure wall. By the time that Thutmose III comes along, he creates a wall that encloses his temple, the sanctuary, and the pathway to the sanctuary. Ramses II, he made a binding wall, a girdle wall, I should say, a girdle wall, which tied in, was within the enclosure wall, but it included the wall that was created by Amenhotep III and Thutmose III. So we have these various walls, but nevertheless, each building structure had its own interior walls. Okay? A number of things I need to point out about the temple as you ascended into it. First and foremost, as you ascended into the temple, the flooring rose and the ceiling descended, so that the point where the sanctuary is located is the highest point where the god rested. Mm-hmm. Second, there was a sacred lake nearby where the priests who were admonished to wash and be pure before administering to the god, as well as providing water for the ceremonies that would be performed in the temple. There was so what we know is that the wall itself, let's say, for example, the enclosure wall, on the outer surface of the enclosure wall was the king is shown defeating the enemies of Egypt. One of the themes, one of the additional themes, and the most dominant theme in the temple was the god giving the king a sword in which to defeat his enemies, and the king, conversely, making presentations of endowments, gold, utensils, things of this nature, as a payback to the god, as well as his responsibility to conduct the ceremony to pray, to ritualize the god. The king is the chief priest. However, because he could not be in every temple at every time of day, he created, elevated priests to be high priests who would perform the ceremony in his behalf at distant temples. Mm-hmm. The third thing is that I mentioned the sacred lake where the god, the water for the temple ritual was secured, and this was linked to the Nile by an underground spring. But more importantly, on festive occasions, there were sacred boats that were placed on the lake, on the sacred lake, so that the ceremony of joviality and what have you would be as it is taking place there, evidence of the gods would be afloat. I said that we need to use analogy and continuity. By continuity, I mean we need to be very circumspect in accepting evidence presented to us. We must be critical. For example, in the beginning, when we first started, I showed you this image of the god Amun as Min in blackface, and I told you that that image is in the Luxor Museum. Well, it was created by Thutmose III, who was of the 18th dynasty. I was reviewing recently the temple of Ramses II at Abu Simbel, and he's of the 19th dynasty. And that same image is in that temple of Amun as Min in blackface. So it goes to show you that many books are written, but this is not one of the primary features that are depicted so that the novice young scholar will get an understanding about how, in essence, Europe kidnapped Egypt as a part of its ploy of intellectual imperialism. You know, we know of
Right.
we know of naked imperialism. We know of enlightened imperialism, but there's also intellectual imperialism.
Absolutely.
And Dr. Carruthers wrote a book called Intellectual Warfare, which is a part of the intellectual imperialism. And the spiritual warfare that is being waged, and that's why I say that our young people need to be serious and do the research and trust their researchers. Okay, now, I wanted to give you, okay, so that's about the continuity. Let's use as an example, analogy. There is this famous Egyptologist called Gaston Maspero, who did what is called the placemats, and we'll talk about this some more later on. The place cards in Cairo Museum. And he uses an example something that is depicted in Ramses III 20th Dynasty Temple, Medinet Habu, to explain some aspects of the wall and the purpose of the wall. He says, at Medinet Habu, we see